Now let's start discussing managing networking on BSD Unix. The first thing we need to talk about when talking about networking is the network interfaces themselves. Now, network interfaces or network cards are normally configured during the setup of the operating system on the computer, and that's done by sysinstall. You're given the option to add cards to configure them using static settings or DHCP and so forth. Now, sysinstall can also be run later if you need to configure them even more, or if you need to add additional cards and so forth. So you can always go back to sysinstall and run that. Another tool that we'll use to configure network interfaces is the ever-popular ifconfig. Now, ifconfig has been ported across several different distributions of Linux and Unix. It's used in Linux, it's used in other distributions of Linux, and so it's a very good, versatile command, and it should be familiar to you if you've ever done any networking on any other kind of Unix or Linux. Let's go ahead and take a look at these two tools now. We're in our FreeBSD 8 box, virtual machine, and what we want to do first is let's go to sysinstall and look at network configurations for a moment. Now we want to go down to configure, and we want to arrow down to the networking entry. And there's several things we can do here, and one of the things that I might want to mention, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, is you can also use this screen to configure network services also, such as NFS, mail, and so forth. For right now, let's look at configure additional network interfaces. Now it's going to show us the interfaces that it's found on the box, and we're going to look at LE0, which is an AMD AM7900 Lance or AM79C9 PCNet Ethernet adapter. Now, one thing I might point out at this point is that if you're used to other Linux or Unix distributions, you may have seen things like ETH0 for Ethernet 0, Ethernet 1, and so forth. Well, BSD Unix names interfaces a little bit differently. It bases them on the driver itself, so whatever kind of card you've got in there. So you might see some strange names from time to time. So that's why sometimes you need to look at sysinstall or do an ifconfig to see exactly what you've got installed. In any case, let's go ahead and look at LE0, which is our Ethernet adapter. And it's going to ask us if we want to do IPv6 on the interface, and right now we don't. We are not connecting to any IPv6 networking, but IPv6 support is there if you need it. And right now we're not going to do DHCP configuration of the interface. Let's say no to this. And so basically we've got our network configuration here for this particular box. We've got a host name of bsd1.vtc.com, and our domain is vtc.com. Our gateway, our default gateway, the next router in line from us, is 192.168.10.1. And we've also got a DNS server listed, a name server, 192.168.10.5. And this is where we can configure our IP address, and it will usually go in and fill in the subnet mask for you based upon the IP address information you enter here. We're going to go ahead and say 192.168.10.6, and there's some options we can put in there for ifconfig, but we're not going to worry about those at this time. Then we're going to say OK, and it's going to ask us if we want the LE0 interface brought back up. We're going to say yes, and then we're going to exit out of the menu, and exit the sysinstaller. Let's go ahead and exit, and let's clear our screen a little bit. And right now, let's look at ifconfig. Now, ifconfig will show you the stats on all the interfaces that are present, that it's detected, but you can also configure individual interfaces as well if you like. Let's go ahead and look at ifconfig, just a basic ifconfig command. And as you can see, we've got a few interfaces here. We've got LE0, which is the interface we just worked with. We've got plib0, and we've got the loopback, LO0, and that's usually the local loopback adapter. Now let's look at LE0 in particular. Notice that we've got a 192.168.10.6 address with a net mask of 255.255.255.0, and it's showing basically the address information we put in there. What we could do if we wanted to is we could go back and change this to DHCP, and we would pick up a DHCP address from a DHCP server, and that uses DH client service, and that will go out broadcast for a DHCP address from a server and get that addressing information automatically. We could have configured that in sysinstall had we liked. We could also reconfigure it here. In order to use ifconfig for this, we would say ifconfig LE0, and we'd put the IP address in here, 192.168.10. Let's go with a 7. We would say netmask, and we would add the 255.255.255.0 address in there. And if we do ifconfig again, then we have a .7 address in there. So we can configure this using ifconfig, or we can configure it using sysinstall. Now, had we gone with DHCP, we would have automatically got those settings. So those are the primary tools that we'll use to configure interfaces to make sure they're up and running and assign IP addressing information to them.